Right, Vidal, let's go back to Mexico. I mean, it is the third largest trade partner of the United States. It's the second biggest export market for U.S. goods. Trump has been talking about renegotiating NAFTA. Well, let's look at that. In 1993, that's a year before NAFTA was signed, trade between these two countries was worth $88 billion. In 2015, that trade was worth $531 billion. That's an increase of more than 500%, 503%. Now he wants to renegotiate NAFTA. I mean, is Mexico going to say, okay, fine, we'll renegotiate this?
I think we have basically no choice because the trade agreement has a specific clause in which leaves open to each one of the three countries to just run out of the deal. So we have to negotiate at some point. Either it would be like a new amended NAFTA, or it might be a new trade agreement, but there's trade, and Trump cannot stop trade just because of an executive order. So we have to have rules for that trade. So it's a fact that you cannot run away. And I think there's going to be a lot of pressure in both sides of the border, in the U.S. and Mexico, to reach an agreement at some level. Maybe not now, because right now everything is really, really scrambled, but in a few months, businessmen are going to be pressuring both governments. I mean, the fact that the deficit is like $60 billion doesn't mean that there are no winners in the U.S. Millions of people are winning from NAFTA in the U.S. And they are not going to want to see trade just fade away, as Mexico doesn't want either.
Right, those figures do point to that, Simon.
But he said something astonishing today that's just worth noting in that address that he made to the Republicans in Philadelphia. He said he's all in favor of negotiating one-on-one trade deals, and he's going to be very pugnacious.
Actually, let me stop you right there. We have that bit of tape. Let's watch this.
And we're going to have trade, but we're going to have one-on-one. And if somebody misbehaves, we're going to send them a letter of termination, 30 days, and they'll either straighten it out or we're gone. Not one of these deals where you can't get out of them and it's a disaster. So we're going to have plenty of trade.
That is exactly the clip I was referring to. Yeah. This idea that you can sign these one-on-one trade deals, which are incredibly complicated documents, and you've got to get them through Congress, and they've got to be negotiated and discussed, and they're going to include a 30-day termination clause. He's approaching the issue of global trade as though you're signing up for cell phone service. I can't even give my cell phone carrier 30 days notice of my intent to terminate my service with them. The idea that these pieces of paper, at any point within 30 days, he doesn't like what he's getting, well, we're just going to write them a letter and we're going to get out of them. Why on earth would anybody bother to go through the entire process of negotiating something that then can simply be pulled out from under them within a month?
And not only that, to add to Simon's point, if you're a corporation and you're setting up, you want to do a foreign direct investment somewhere, you have plans, you make long-term strategic plans based on trade deals. You don't want to know or to think that this trade deal can be pulled out from the rug anytime within 30 days. And so for someone who's as business friendly as Donald Trump, that doesn't make sense.
He's right about one thing. He needs his commerce secretary to be confirmed, and then he really needs to listen to him.
Right. Afshin, what about the point that, something that Barack Obama said more than once? He said, we don't want China to be writing the rules.
Right.
That's why he was promoting TPP. We want to write the rules. But now, that's not going to happen.
No, it's not going to happen. And when you retreat, when you create vacuums, others step in.
Exactly.
And we're seeing it. We're going to see it in China and Asia Pacific. We're seeing it in Syria. There was an extraordinary meeting taking place in Kazakhstan about the Syrian civil war. And guess what? The Western envoys were cooling their heels in a hotel bar while Russia, Turkey, and the Syrian opposition and Iran were negotiating the contours of the future of Syria. And while the Western envoys were totally shut out of that. So this is what happens when you step away, you create vacuums, others step in.
Right, and they will impose their influence on that as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Sam, another big foreign policy issue, that is the South China Sea. The White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer said the United States would stop China from encroaching on international waters in the South China Sea. Let's listen to what he said.
I think areas in the South China Sea that are part of international waters and international activities, I think the U.S. is going to make sure that we protect our interests there. So it's a question of if those islands are in fact in international waters and not part of China proper, then yeah, we're going to make sure that we defend international territories from being taken over by one country.
He's talking about the islands that are being taken over by one country. This is how the Chinese Foreign Ministry responded to that.
China has indisputable sovereignty over the South China Sea islands and their adjacent waters. China is firm in safeguarding our rights and interests, and we are also committed to peaceful negotiations with countries concerned. China firmly upholds freedom of navigation and overflight in the South China Sea in accordance with international law.
So, Sam, does this dispute here have the potential to become a major confrontation?
Very, very likely, because when the U.S. government said that they want to deny the access of the Chinese to those disputed water and islands, how could the U.S. do that? Blockade? The blockade means in international law a declaration of war. And for Chinese side, they have seen that as their own territory, I mean sovereign territory. They see that as a core national interest, which means that it is non-negotiable. They cannot compromise. They will defend it up to the way to conduct a war. So if the U.S. wants to use military force to protect the U.S. interests or those deny Chinese access to those islands, a war is likely. But I don't think that's what exactly the U.S., I mean, the Tillerson, when he had that congressional hearing, meant. I don't think he thought that through very well, because the U.S. is not ready to have escalation in this part of the world. This is too complicated. U.S. has a military advantage for sure over China, but this is far away from U.S. Sure, U.S. territory is much closer to the Chinese shore, although Chinese naval forces is not up to the level of U.S. forces. But China has the advantage of supplies or everything. And also, the interest is asymmetric. For U.S., it's a faraway interest, and most is the freedom of navigation issue. But for China, it's a sovereignty. It's a core national interest issue. So that asymmetric national interest consideration would also play into the whole consideration. So I don't think the U.S. is ready to move to that front. So at this stage of the Trump administration, put this issue on the table and to fight with China on these issues are not, in fact, to the point of the Trump is talking about. He talked America first. So he talked about, in my mind, geoeconomics more than geopolitics. Yeah. So it's totally contradictory to his own campaign slogans and issues.
Okay, Simon, the one other issue that divides the United States under President Trump from China, and that is trade. President Trump, during the election campaign, made all kinds of accusations against China. President Xi Jinping responded at the World Economic Forum in Davos by saying that no one will win in a trade war. So when we look at what is going on between these two countries, when we look at what China is saying, the outreach from China, championing globalization, etc., Trump talking about America first, are we going to see China fill in that space, fill in that gap, take up global economic leadership?
I think there's every possibility that that scenario comes about. I actually was saying on other broadcasts shortly after Donald Trump finished his inaugural address that while America was so intensely focused on Donald Trump's inaugural address, understandably, at the end of the day, the speech that was made that week with the greatest degree of historical echo is almost certainly going to be Xi Jinping's speech at Davos, not Donald Trump's speech in front of 300,000 people, not 1.5 million people up on Capitol Hill. On the issue of the South China Sea, Donald Trump was not sent to Washington by his supporters to take a stand on freedom of navigation. They are all about job creation, and he understands that, and every speech that he makes, including that inaugural address, is all about, as Sam correctly observes, America first, and that is going to be the policy, this seemingly isolationist, pugnacious America first policy that he continues to adopt. So in geostrategic terms, in economic terms, the opening exists for China, the opening exists for Vladimir Putin, perhaps partly even orchestrated by Vladimir Putin for these people to assume more powerful positions as these tectonic plates shift, and America's role as the quote-unquote indispensable nation slowly atrophies.
Right. Vidal, looking at the situation with Mexico right now, we've got a bit of a standoff. You know, the Mexican president says he's not coming here. The United States talking about slapping tariffs. What happens next? How do they undo this?
I think time sort of will heal this chain of offenses from the U.S. to Mexico, because Mexico is really interested in fixing things. We are very much dependent on the U.S., so we both see this as an opportunity to look elsewhere, China, India, some other countries, but we cannot stay away from the U.S. for a long time. And also, there are a lot of interests of the U.S. in Mexico, security, and also even trade. Lots of things that have to do with trade. So eventually, I think the fact that there are economic and other type of gains to be shared between these two countries will get them to the table, and they will start negotiating. And
right.
It will be a painful negotiation, yes, but it has to be done. I don't see any other way.
Afshin, one other issue, very controversial issue, torture, waterboarding. Yeah. Donald Trump said during an interview with in a U.S. television network, ABC, that he believes that torture, waterboarding, works. Mm-hmm. In fact, it was counteracted by his defense secretary, General Mattis, who said torture doesn't work. But are we going to see the return of CIA black sites and waterboarding?
You know, this is a really important question, Anand, because when as you said, General Mattis is opposed to it. People like Senator John McCain, who actually has been tortured, is opposed to it. So, you know, when you talk to most people who've, you know, worn the American military uniform, they argue that this doesn't work. Not only the amount of information that you might get from torture does not justify how it undermines America's values, and so you know, but with Donald Trump, it's hard to tell, because it does seem that there is a seat of the pants quality to what he's doing and what he's saying, and sometimes he'll get ahead of himself and he'll say something, and I think he's constantly throwing these trial balloons up in the air and waiting to see how people react to them. And I think to some extent there is the U.S. media has not been doing a very good job of reacting to Donald Trump, because he'll throw a provocative statement into the air, and then that entire evening's nightly news block will be about that statement, and then the American people are kind of missing what else is happening in the world, and what else is happening even in policy.
Perhaps that is the strategy.
It is absolutely. So we all have to sort of, you know, adjust to this new normal, as I described it.
Right, Simon.
I'll tell you who is going to raise the issue of torture, and that's Theresa May when she visits.
This is exactly what I was going to ask you about.
Tomorrow.
Theresa May meeting tomorrow at the White House.
Huge reward. Potentially, she becomes the first foreign leader to walk through the door of the Oval Office and make her case for a trade deal between the US and the UK once the UK leaves the European Union. Donald Trump says he's open to it, but huge risk for Theresa May in all of this. Donald Trump speaking about the use of torture. His top presidential advisor, Stephen Bannon, just a few hours ago, calling the news media the opposition party, saying that journalists need to learn to shut their mouths. Yeah. There's no way Theresa May escapes questions about that, and she's going to want to push back on Donald Trump's assertion that NATO is obsolete, not a view shared in Whitehall.
Is she going to try and put the brakes, try and get him to temper his comments on NATO, that it's obsolete, that you know, European countries have to start increasing their budgets?
There's this tremendous division between Donald Trump and the defense secretary that he's appointed and the foreign policy establishment in Washington. Right. So I think what she's going to want to try and find out, and she probably began that task in Philadelphia a few hours ago when she was talking to Paul Ryan, is who is actually running the show here? Who is actually setting the agenda? Is NATO obsolete, as Donald Trump maintains, or is NATO the most valuable military alliance in modern history, and American involvement with it should be deepened, as his own defense secretary maintains? Who comes out on top of that conversation? That's going to be the story of the next 4 years.
And that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Aaron Naidu in Washington, D.C.